Greetings, friends and relatives. It's so good to have you join us today. And it's wonderful to be able to honor Orange Shirt Day as we remember our children. And it's great to have the orange shirts out there. And I want to thank everybody that participated in yesterday's events in Rapid City for the Remembering the Children Memorial. And I'll have Amy talk more about that, as well as today being Orange Shirt Day. It's not as commonly known in America as it is in Canada, because that's where the origins of Orange Shirt Day started, when the Canadian government indicated that there was obviously some history going on with the boarding schools in Canada. And now we have the attention being brought to the kids here in America that went to the over 400 Indian boarding schools out there. So we really appreciate you joining us today, and we're excited to share this film. Me personally, not only as a producer, but and a storyteller, but this film showcases my mom, Beverly Stabber Warne, who recently made her journey. And so I'm so glad that she's in some of my films and she's still able to educate and share her stories for those future generations that we're all here to honor, as well as those past generations that went through the horrible realities of the boarding schools. And before I move forward, I want to introduce my co-hosts here. And first of all, Lucian over at Virginia Commonwealth University. I work with their Rehabilitation Research and Training Center, and they use several of my films for curriculum, including this one, addressing some of those intergenerational trauma aspects as a result of the outcome of multi-generations of boarding school. So those are leading into some of those challenges that we have with disability and other public health challenges today in Indian country. So there's a variety of layers of what Orange Shirt Day means in honoring those children. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Amy. And Amy, if you could share some of your perspectives regarding Orange Shirt Day and the importance of today, but also yesterday's wonderful event. So thank you for being here, first of all, sis. Really appreciate you taking time.
Yeah, no, thank you for the invite, Jimmy. I'm always happy to collaborate and to continue working on this film, and also the visibility around boarding schools and the complex and difficult history that we have here in the United States. And I'm really focused on working on the Remembering the Children Memorial, which is a project focused on the Rapid City Indian boarding school, where about at least 50 children passed away while in attendance. While working on this project, though, you're really opening a can of worms by learning, tracing back histories, then also looking to the impacts of boarding school that we all see today. So I'm really thrilled to be able to share the work that we've all done together and this story. And always appreciate, Bev and her perspectives. And that was one thing I remembered yesterday. And I know she wasn't there physically, but felt her presence, and her words are always echoing in my mind. And I know I'm not the only one. But we're looking forward to the days where we feel we're moving on the path to healing. And I shared something with Dawn yesterday that I always think about. And your mom always said, it runs through us until it doesn't. Talking about historical trauma and epigenetics and the way that it affects our own reactions to trauma and drama. And I think that's the lesson here for all of us. It runs through us until it doesn't. And we've chosen to address the issues and start talking about it, but also start talking about possible pathways to healing. And that's exciting, and it feels good, and it feels like we're turning a corner for our people. So thank you again, Jimmy. And yeah, yesterday was the grand opening of the memorial. So we built a site that honors the children that lived and died at the boarding school, tells the story of U.S. history, Canadian history, and local history, and then starts bringing together ways that we can educate ourselves and continue to inform the next generations about this history that we all carry in our DNA. So it was a beautiful day. It was a good day of remembrance. We've lost a couple team members in the last year, so it was a good day to remember our matriarch, Bev Warne, And also one of our Lexies that always supported us, Travis Harden, who designed the blanket that was created with the project. But beautiful day, beautiful people. It was really a day of gratitude, and I look forward to gathering again this next spring or summer to install a sculpture, but also to name the plaza, to dedicate the plaza to Bev in our Beverly Stabber Warne Memorial Plaza, and to be able to plant the cedar around it for Hantewi. So she'll continue giving to our community the way she did every day she was here. So looking forward to seeing everybody in person again and inviting everybody out to the site.
Oh, thank you so much, Palamia, sis, and for the work that you do. And then I see Ina, mom's picture behind you. And thank you for keeping her memory going, not only just for her memory, but because of the work that she did needs to continue. And I always say she left some big footprints for all of us to fill because we can't fill them alone. And I even got big feet and I can't make a mark. Hey, but that's something where I think she wanted was us collectively to do what we could to make a difference for those future generations. And uh, Amy, we'll have you share some more later as we get some more questions and from the audience. But Jill, I want to introduce Jill. She's former tribal leader from Hoopa, her people in Northern California, and she also happens to be my wife. And I know that she was part of this a lot, working with mom and me and the family in developing this film with the community members like Amy and so many of the volunteers and the elders that kept this story alive is so important. So I'm so glad that you can be here and share your perspectives, not only as a California tribal member, but as a former tribal leader and an Indigenous woman. So thank you for being with us today.
Oh, do you want me to say something? um, so I am wearing my orange shirt, which is actually the color that our offices chose this year to represent our tribal organization. I work for the Native American Environmental Protection Coalition, and we have many tribes in several states that we work with. And so Orange Shirt Day, I'm like, why does everyone keep calling it a national day? Because the sad thing is that this is not a recognized day in the United States. This is not, unlike Canada, who recognizes it as a federal holiday, if you could call it that, in remembrance of the children who were lost. And it started the orange shirt because people probably don't know, and maybe you were going to explain it, but originates from the story of a young woman who was sent to boarding school around the age of 6. And she actually was looking forward to it or excited to go to school. And her mom went and they bought a new outfit. And so she was going to go to school, and she was excited at the idea that she was going to learn new things. And she got to the school and they took the clothes away from her, destroyed the clothes. And I think, and that memory has stuck with her from that very first day. And I think, can anyone imagine, because we have grandchildren who are 6, who are 5, can anyone imagine taking a brand new outfit from a child? And more than likely they burned it because they have this idea that Native Americans, tribal people are dirty. So they probably burned it. And I thought, man, that is so powerful when you think of this young girl, 6 years old, in a new outfit, full of dreams, to have the memory of her dreams being destroyed before her very eyes. First day. And my reservation, which is located in Northern California, we had a boarding school on our reservation. It no longer exists, but the graveyard does. I don't know that we had any children who lost their lives. I've tried to research it personally, but I know that there was a graveyard there, it's, I don't even know how many of our tribal members recognize that the graveyard exists. And I always try to look for it because those, it's unknown. Did we have children who died there? And my grandfather attended boarding school, and he didn't talk about it very much, but he did, he did let us know that, boy, they could just whip the tar out of you. He said, and sometimes when we were down in the where they kept them in the basement when they were being punished for this thing or that, he remembers how hungry he was. And I just think, how does any human being do that to another human being? And I hope that the tribes originating and making today a Orange Shirt Day among ourselves, I hope that the United States recognizes what they did with all those boarding schools and the impact that they made on our lives for generations, right? Generations, in the sense, my grandfather didn't want us to know our language because he was so afraid that we would be treated less than if we were to learn that language. And when I worked in our language programs in Hoopa, we had some deep conversations about why he didn't teach my father to speak. And it really caused a lot of deep reflections. So the fact that now, today, we can stand up and say, we need to remember this. And, it's kind of like, I'm going to go Hunger Games on everybody. We need to remember who the enemy is. And it is not us as tribal people. It is not us as fellow tribal nations. It is the government. They are the enemy. They will continue to be the enemy. And we have to continue the fight today to make sure that we are protected, our environment is protected. I work in an environment, so that we have clean air. And I honestly believe that it's going to be the recognition of tribes as nations and our own status that is going to help us meet the challenges that the whole earth is facing, that our mother is facing.
Thank you, Jill, and bringing that attention as a tribal member, but also as a former tribal leader, and working with the federal government and state government, as well as local municipalities that often have challenging aspects of working with Indian country, obviously. So thank you for sharing that. We appreciate your viewpoints. And again, I wanted to have another tribal perspective so that we can see that this is not only an issue for just a few tribes. These boarding schools were throughout the nation and had a great impact on many of our tribal people. I'm going to go ahead and share right now. Hopefully this works correctly, and so that you can, let's see. So hopefully you can see that okay. But again, this is remembering the children and Orange Shirt Day, which is such a significant day in Canada, but also for us in the United States as members of tribal nations. So this is something where we want to, as Jill said, have the federal government as well as other governments recognize what happened in these boarding schools and some of the impacts that we're still dealing with today, and in many of our communities as a result of these boarding schools. So I was very honored to be able to produce this film that we're going to share in honor of my mom, Beverly Stabber Warne. And you see here is her nursing class of 1962, before I was born. And so she was already achieving things that was unusual for many of us in Indian country, and participating in the academic system and having success. And being a nurse for so many years, over 60 years, this is her in front of the school where she got her degree in 1962, and then 60 years later, she's standing on those stairs in front of the same building, holding that picture of herself. And again, we just want to remember her work and continue her positive footprints that she made. So she had many interactions, we'll call them, with federal government and other folks that provided some of those obstacles and barriers and found ways to get around those things. So in honor of Mom, we want to, and others that were survivors of these boarding schools, we want to make sure that folks realize that this isn't ancient history. This happened recently, and many of our elders, like my mom, went through these boarding schools when the intent was to beat the language out of the children, beat the culture out of the children. And an unfortunate reality is many kids perish at these schools. As Amy mentioned, 50 have been identified so far at Rapid City Indian boarding school, but many of these kids were not identified or not buried with headstones. They were just buried out in the fields and not identified, unfortunately. And we're wanting to remember those kids that weren't identified in many of these roles in the school systems at that time. But my mom tells a great story in terms of she enjoyed being in the fields because that was part of the boarding schools, was to train Native people. And in terms of not only in the school and setting in the morning, but also learning those skills to work in the fields and things of that nature, which was the expectation of the employment outcome of these schools, was just field work and things like that. But Mom enjoyed this time because out in the fields, they could speak Lakota. They could speak their native language without getting beaten and punished like they were in the classroom. So when I see this picture, I often think of her out there speaking her language and keeping her, her culture alive, her language alive, so she knows who she is as an elder. And she was able to teach that. And after boarding school, the family took a wagon and the horses and moved to Rapid City from Pine Ridge. And this is Oshkosh Indian Camp, because at the time with segregation, we were not allowed to live in housing yet in Rapid City. So Mom and the family lived here so that Grandpa Louie, her dad, could get work in the lumber yard. And she, at 13 years old, started working in the kitchens at a restaurant where she worked for many years, actually through college, and helped support herself and the family as she progressed in her schooling. So when she thinks of this area, it was kind of a refugee camp along Rapid Creek, but it was all Lakota. So the languages was there, the culture was there. Obviously, there was some negative aspects living in this environment, but at least that gave Mom access to education in Rapid City. Here you see the map of Pine Ridge Reservation and our neighbors over the Chichangus and Rosebud. But you see Kyle is circled there. That's where Mom is from. That's where our family is from, primarily Kyle Village. And that's where they moved from to Rapid City. Up in the corner there, you see where Rapid City is in comparison to the reservation. So with these realities, Mom did encounter trauma. You're going to hear her story when she first went to the city with her dad and seeing her first No Indians Allowed sign, which was obviously traumatic. But when you think on a national scale, you see when we were in Department of War for those first 400 years, there was obviously a decline in population due to war and disease and germ warfare and things of that nature. But you see that our population has grown again to what we were prior to European contact. But with that 500 years of experience, that has brought in not only cultural trauma, historical trauma, and intergenerational trauma, excuse me, but some of those challenges are still identifying and manifesting themselves today. Imagine if you grew up in that environment where you didn't have your parents or a family that loved you and provided you those basic needs like Maslow's needs. of love and just those basic necessities. They didn't have that. And in many cases, it was multi-generations. So when you look at the education system on what they were trying to do of kill the Indian, save the man, obviously that wasn't a good way of doing things in terms of, trying to utilize the education system to include Indian people. So as mentioned in Canada, the Pope was there last year apologizing for what the church did in those boarding schools in Canada. And Canada did a $2.8 billion settlement with the tribes so that they can get some funds to kind of correct the wrongs of what happened in their boarding schools. So that's good news on the Canadian side of things, but yet we're still dealing with just basic awareness here in America. And when you think of our traditional learning styles, this was our traditional way of learning. When you look at these elders, they were the knowledge keepers, the ones that taught us and told us those stories. So we had critical thinking, problem solving, those approaches to education. But that changed with the classroom and the boarding schools. So suddenly our kids were taken from their homes, and it was legal to take kids from homes in those days. Otherwise, there was legal ramifications as a result. So this is Henry Pratt, who started the boarding schools, and he was in Fort Marion prison and decided that we should educate the Indian prisoners. So I kind of jokingly say this was our first Indian boarding school, was Fort Marion Prison in Florida, where a lot of Geronimo's people were taken after their war with the United States. So this was where we first started. And then the first school to accept Indian students was Hampton Black College. So this was the first experience that Indian students from these different prisons and different nations starting to be brought in. This was the first inclusion of Indian students. And unfortunately, they had a negative view of us as well as humanity when they think of the the dirty, ignorant price of humanity that we were, was their perspectives. And unfortunately, that came from even our African-American brothers and sisters at the time that went through their own process of boarding schools. And then when we look at where my mom went to school, again, this was some of the, foundation of how she was able to fight and keep who she is as a Lakota person. And for many of us, when we think of our class pictures when we were in, third, fourth, fifth grade, like my grandson is now, they're smiling, they're look like they're in a safe environment, but none of these kids seem to look happy or safe. These are some of those young ones that initially started at Carlisle Indian School. And when I teach and when I'm out there sharing these stories, I always ask for those that went to boarding school, our non-Indian brothers and sisters that did go to boarding schools, I ask how big are their cemeteries? And generally they don't even have a cemetery. So it's not a common aspect of boarding school experience unless you look at Indian boarding schools. And here's Carlisle, and I want to commend Carlisle and of course working with the Department of Defense on getting these kids back from the cemeteries and bringing them home. And we had some of our children brought home just 2 weeks ago, and that was a good, healing experience in terms of bringing them home, but also brought attention to that trauma that many people face. So there's still many kids that are in that cemetery today in Pennsylvania. And again, more and more of the kids are being brought home. I believe Nez Perce just last week brought some of their kids home from this cemetery. And I brought my son to Haskell. He was considering going to Haskell Indian School in Kansas, and this is their cemetery. And in the museum, they have the baby handcuffs that were used for the kids that were being punished for speaking their language or trying to escape or whatever the situation was. But again, a significant cemetery. And then here in California, Riverside, as I said, it was nationwide that these kids were impacted by these schools, and many of them did not survive as a result of some of the punishment and the abuse that was going on. So a reality now today is that many of these boarding schools that are still operating, they're not necessarily boarding schools, but there's Indian schools that used to be boarding schools have now become a haven for many students. So we have a generation of students that saw their boarding school experience in a positive light. And that's the unfortunate reality of those multi-generations of people not able to get this experience of having their mother and father, and as a child, that surrounding a family, the extended family, the tioshpai, the community, and then again, the connection to Mother Earth, as well as the next generation philosophies. That's just some of our indigenous ways of knowing that many of our kids did not get as a result of these boarding schools. So I like this image of the buffalo circling up and protecting the kids in the middle as outside forces are trying to do damage and harm to those kids. So this is a good way of for us to follow our four-legged example and see what we can do for the future generations. And this is a beautiful photo taken. And it was just a day when these young ladies went up and sang an honor song at this hill that is now the memorial. So it looks much different now today because there's a memorial site that's been built there. And as Amy said, it's going to open next spring, and it's going to be a wonderful area of remembrance and honoring those children. So this is a famous painting from our Canadian brothers and sisters. Whitney Gould did this painting of their depiction of the kids that were found in these graves. A small child's voice whispers, they found us. And all of us as human beings, that particularly our grandparents or parents, have a unique viewpoint of those future generations and wanting a better world for our takojas, our grandkids. And these are my grandkids that Jill mentioned, and we're doing everything we can to ensure that they have a good future for their, their future generations as well. So I'll stop the share there. And then before we start screening the film, Amy, do you have anything you want to add about the film before we start the film officially?
I think one of the important aspects about our film is that it documents a long history of oral histories in our community. And you'll hear stories about the Oshkosh camp and about really the Indian experience, the experience of Indigenous people in this community for over the last 100 years. And it's really important because it validates our presence here. It validates the experiences of the Indian community here and in the surrounding tribal communities. But I'm always really proud of this idea that this story came from the community, and it was held by the community and remembered. And we are just in position to take that story and to create, the memorial site, this film, and be able to use all of the ways that we know how now to document these things and document this history and these stories. So always want to acknowledge, Unji Bev, but also Eva Nichols and Emma Amiot and Marie Rogers, Cecilia Montgomery and Sharon Lazat, all of these advocates, longtime advocates and matriarchs of our community who kept this story alive and honored those children and their memories all these years, and also fought for access to the land that we are now building on. So we are standing on the backs of giants, and they're all matriarchs and all elder Indigenous women, and I don't think that's a coincidence either. So I was really happy to hear yesterday we had tribal leaders there, and one of them said, it was good to honor this story, but he said, it's time to honor the women and the backbone of our societies and how women have carried our people for so long through a lot of this trauma. And it was really nice to hear that. And it feels like we are kind of coming to a place where we can openly discuss these things now and the effects that they continue to have on our communities. But shout out again to all of the matriarchs out there, to all of those women, especially in the Rapid City community. And I didn't name everybody, so forgive me for forgetting any names. There's about 20 of them total. So I just want to acknowledge those names that continue to come up, and the families that are proud of their grandmas and their aunties and their moms. So thank you, and excited for everybody to see it.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Palamia, for those words and recognizing our unchis, our grandmas that really kept the story alive. And there were the key elders that really brought this attention to the Lands Project and uncovering some of those untold stories that we can share through this film. So we'll go ahead and Lucian, if you could, get ready to start the film. And again, this is in honor of those kids throughout all the boarding schools throughout not only the United States, but Canada. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy Remember the Children. Lamia. We'll have a question and answer after the film is over for those that would like to share. So thank you. Hope you enjoy.
It was early evening. The lights, downtown lights, were just coming on. And it was exciting for me to go to town for the first time. That's when I saw the sign for the first time, no Indians allowed. And so I stopped short. I was 9 years old. I'd reached the age of reason. I knew who I was as a Lakota person. I knew our culture was beautiful, although I didn't know how to express it in those words. I knew that we were good people. My father stopped, of course, because he was holding my hand, and he looked down at me and he said, "Daku, what?" And I pointed to the sign and I said, "Dakue, why?" And of course, he said something very wise, which I didn't totally grasp the meaning of it until later, when he said, "Because they don't know us." But my first emotion, now that I think about it, have the words to describe it, it was rage. And then later it turned to sadness. And then the third feeling that came about with time was curiosity. Who would say that to another human being? I still don't know, after all these years. This idea of racism, it does not make sense to me. Never will.
The Children's Memorial is going to be significant to Rapid City and our community because we are uncovering this hidden story, and it didn't just happen here in Rapid City, it happened across the country, but we can be one of the first to embrace that story and tell the story of the kids that lived here and that died at the school. But I think that it's really just an opportunity to embrace this story that hasn't been told.
My role in the Lands Project is I'm one of the original historians that collected some of the oral histories and started to put the puzzle together. The Rapid City Indian School opened its doors to a small, handful of families in 1898. The school operated for just over 30 years. By 1930, it was transitioning to serve just children with TB. The federal government started closing these boarding schools during the Depression. So the Rapid City Indian School closed in 1933. TB was rampant and healthcare was segregated. You had a white TB sanatorium in Custer called the Sanator. And then we needed our own TB hospital, Susan, the Rapid City TB Sanatorium. By the 1960s, they were able to treat TB with modern drugs, and it was converted to a clinic to serve our people. It's still operating now. It's Oyate Health Center.
The Rapid City Indian School was actually very similar in its design and purpose and nature to literally hundreds of federal boarding schools and church-run boarding schools across the United States. And the goal was to use Christian conversion and assimilation to try to solve what was widely known at the time as the quote-unquote Indian problem. And the Indian problem was basically simply the fact that across North America, as the United States was going to expand westward, there were native people, indigenous people all across the continent. And it also had enormous economic implications in terms of access to land and water and other kinds of resources that filled tribal lands at that time. And so boarding schools themselves were very deeply integrated into these various kinds of policy decisions.
They acquired 1,200 acres in West Rapid, which was not Rapid City. It was out in the country at the time. They acquired this 1,200 acres for a self-sustaining boarding school. The entire time the school was open, the children got minimal half-day of education, but half a day of manual labor. School was very institutional. It was governed by the bell. The children had very structured lives. They woke up at a certain time. They went to the mess hall. They ate. They marched in formation. They wore garrison caps and military-style uniforms. So it was a very structured, regimented, very foreign concept. These schools were designed to erase our culture, our language, our economy, our laws, everything about who we were and our identity. So it was a very lonely existence.
The goal of the boarding school was to assimilate Native children. And the idea was, if you could take Native people out of their communities, take them away from their families, take them off tribal land, and bring them to these schools, cut their hair, force them to not speak their language, force them to not follow any cultural practices, that you could literally force a Native child to become a white child. Most Native people never received from that process anything better than a version of second-class citizenship. So it was a broken idea to begin with.
My grandmother was born in 1892, and she attended the school about 1904 with her brother, who was only 10 years old. Her brother worked in the fields, which were planted with crops, all in the floodplain by Rapid Creek. And the children were undernourished. They would supplement their diet however they could. And, he pocketed a potato. He wound up bringing this to the boiler room, where there was a terrible explosion, and the boiler went up a whole flight. His body was so charred, they identified him by his shoes. My grandmother was pulled out of school, and he was buried at the Mary Magdalene Cemetery, which is in the Badlands, at 10 years old. Was it preventable? Absolutely. I mean, children were not protected. Their lives meant nothing.
When I was probably 6, around there, I went back to St. Joseph's Indian School. So I couldn't speak English. The only language I knew was Lakota. And there was a lot of other kids like me. And so we talked to each other, in Lakota and all of that. The nuns started punishing us for that. They rubbed bar of soap into my mouth. Real hard. They hold you by your hair like this, and you don't know what they're saying. You don't know what the words coming because you don't understand it. When they turn the water on and they're pushing your head towards it, first couple of times it was real scary. The next few times I wanted to get to that water and get the water in my mouth and get that soap out of my mouth because it was all stuck in there, When they're teaching you to read, they're having you repeat English words. If you couldn't say the English words correctly, you were hit. They take your hand and they have a ruler with a metal thing in it, and they hit you across your hands. I have scars here yet. And they hit you until it bled. When we went home from the first year of school, we got off the bus and my grandma said something and I looked at her and I didn't understand her. I looked at my brother, what'd she say? And he said, "Did you forget?" Then he repeated it, "Do you remember?" Then he did it, said it again, and then he said, "Do you remember?" And I remembered. I was scared my grandma was gonna come wash my mouth out with soap. I know she wouldn't do that, but that was my fear for, for not understanding her, So that was my experience with that.
Around 2013, Susan was celebrating the 75th anniversary of its existence as a hospital. So not focused so much on the boarding school part of the story, but the hospital side. And while they were doing that, they gave the presentation, and a group of elder Lakota women who had attended the presentation from the Rapid City community came to those folks and said, "What are you going to do about the graves?" And our teammates said, what graves? We didn't know anything about this. And as it turned out, the Native community in Rapid City, primarily the Native women elders from the community, had for decades maintained the memory and the stories of a large number of children who died at the school. In some cases, we would later find out whose families were never informed of what happened to them. The story of where they were buried had disappeared. So our project got started simply as an effort to be responsive to this request that we look into what happened to these children.
When we first started looking for the children, there were not a lot of examples. Things have changed pretty dramatically over the last decade, but at the time, we were starting from scratch. And so our first job was to figure out where in the world they might be able to be. And so we had to find the boundaries, the original boundaries of the boarding school, which we knew were beyond what is called Susan, or the hospital campus, which is the former boarding school campus. We spent probably 3 months combing through pages and pages in order to figure out where the original boundaries were. We identified a parcel that was still in federal ownership and had nothing on it. And it was landlocked. And that was odd. Because of these original 1,200 acres that belonged to the boarding school, you can imagine there were a lot of land-hungry people, and pretty much every single inch had been gifted to one entity or another. And so to identify this last remaining federal parcel that was landlocked and had no development on it, but was developed completely around it, made us think that there was a high probability that somebody saved this parcel for a reason when all that land was being allocated. We then began to collect oral histories from either folks who had worked at Susan and had met with elders at one point in time and received their oral histories, or elders that had children or family members that had attended earlier on in its history. We did so carefully as to not indicate our suspicions about where we thought the children might be located. And to the person, they indicated that the bodies were in this location across the street from Susan, where we thought it might be. And so we combined essentially the legal land research with the traditional oral history collection, and that pinpointed where we thought they were most likely to be. We took 2 additional steps. We invited medicine people to come walk the grounds with us to provide their insight, and we met with the tribal historic preservation officers from the tribes in South Dakota, and we invited them to attend. And much later in the oral history process, we obtained an eyewitness oral history confirming that his mother had visited scaffold burials there as well. We also made a promise to those children that we would not forget them. And it was that day and that promise that has kept this project going the entire time.
Hamadak Yapi, Lafanjanisi Machiapi. Thank you for being here this morning. This is our 4th annual Children's Memorial Walk with the Rapid City Indian Boarding School Lands Project. We want to remind everybody that everyone is welcome here. We never want anyone to feel that they cannot join and be a part of this process today.
The Lands Project assembled a team of researchers. It did come up with a pretty comprehensive list of who attended the school, some correspondents who died at the school. To date, we have 50 children that we know died while attending the school.
These children bring us together who are forgotten by Rapid City for decades, except by our grandmothers. Our Unchis who have done the hard work raising us, molding us, and never allowing us to be forgotten. And with that, today is also known in Rapid City as Unchi Ta Ampetu, the Day of the Grandmothers. All right, so now we're going to start passing out the names. If more children are here, we'd be honored if you would come carry a name of a child. The records were so shoddy that only thing listed was that it was a male and the date of death. So we have male child, 1926. Unnamed child, age unknown, date of death, 1926. Female child number 1, age unknown, date of death 1919. Mark Sherman, Oglala Sioux, age 17, date of death October 16th, 1910. Mark Sherman was hit by a train trying to run away from the Rapid City Indian Boarding School.
So one of our goals with the Rapid City Indian Boarding School Lands Project is to build a children's memorial so that we ensure that their memories stay alive here in our community and that we make sure that we honor them and their families and their place here in Rapid City.
The evolution of the boarding school project, I think, has dramatically outgrown any of our expectations in the beginning. Our goal was to find the children and to honor the requests of the elders in the community. And that took us about 2 years in order to do so, maybe 3. But in the course of doing that research is when we stumbled upon the rest of the Pandora's box of equity and other legal issues that were raised. And so that has sort of snowballed into the multiple projects that we see today. We have an entire memorial park to memorialize the children. We have a project to find equity in some land that was in violation. We have a community development team. We have a community center team. We have an education team. And we've had hundreds of volunteers over the year in different phases of each of those. So that was certainly not anything that we could have imagined or visioned at the time. But this story is so personal to so many people that it provides a really positive outlet to work on the things that everybody think is important to them.
Our responsibilities as Native people and non-Native people is to remember history and knowing the truth of history, no matter where it is. And we know that there are many children that died during the time of being students at the boarding school. 50 have been identified, but we know there are more. They may never be located. And so we need to always keep that in mind, that that those little ones, however way they died, however way they felt, we need to honor that and remember it with reverence and respect, which will be created with the Children's Memorial. And knowing that it's going to make a positive impact on our future generations, not just with the Native children and population, but the non-Native people as well.
My daughters know the stories, but they carry who they are, like, with grace instead of with trauma. But my daughters are also, from knowing this story, are willing to fight for this story. And that's different too. Our people haven't always been in that position. We've been carrying it, but it's been heavy. And by telling this story and having this memorial and having this place where we talk about it, like, my daughters carry it with strength, and they're gonna fight for those kids, and they're gonna keep telling this story. And we have the potential to do that for all of our young people, and it's going to be amazing. You know, they just don't carry the trauma the same way because it's out in the open. We've unpacked it for them.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and allowing us to share this film with you, particularly on Orange Shirt Day, that we hope will be a day of recognition and memorial for our Indian students that went through these boarding schools. And many of them did not make it out of those schools alive. And we don't want their lives to be wasted, and we want them to be remembered and acknowledged, to where we have our young generations today that are proud of who they are and knowing their language and having that opportunity to be proud Indigenous people in America. So at this point, I don't know if we can do chats or not chats, but question and answer at this point. Lucian, if you could see if there's any folks that want to have some opportunity to share. But Amy, again, if you wouldn't mind sharing about yesterday, because I believe in the film that was 3 or 4 years ago where they had the memorial walk, and we were still discussing the opportunity of creating a memorial there. So if you're still in the office, hey. But yes, if you could share, because it's wonderful to see the progression since we've made this film. If you could share, please.
Yeah, no, it feels really good to see it actually happening. And I remember when construction started this spring, the first day they scraped the top of the soil and you could see the outline of design of what we know the design to be. You know, we were up on top of the hill and we're just shocked that it's actually happening. Really proud to be able to work on it and to bring this story to our community and preserve it, but really looking forward to the ways that we continue down pathways of healing, where we have people, where we're working through how to deal with stress, how to deal with trauma, how are the ways that we are removing trauma and from our bodies. And it's been a really interesting journey, and really grateful for the mentors that I've had along the way. One thing I want to bring up, you know, we talk about in that film, and I always hate that part of the film because Arlo made me cry by asking me questions, and it was good. They were really good questions, and I knew where he was leading me. But going back to, you know, I mentioned my kids, my daughters, and the way that they see this story, and the indignation and the not anger, but the outrage that they have, that they haven't learned this before, and that they never talk about it in school. And both of my daughters have voiced that in their classrooms, just saying that there's so much more, you know, that we don't talk about. And I want to, you know, one of the things that I've really focused on is you know, we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, we talk about epigenetics, and really trying to get on the side of intergenerational healing. And your mom was a big part of that. And the other side of that spectrum is the youth. And yesterday we had the Sutrango Youth Council, the young people from the Rosebud Sioux tribe who initiated the bringing for children to come home from Carlisle and be buried at a veteran cemetery in Rosebud. And they spoke about their experience and how it shaped who they are as young adults, and how they encourage other young people to learn about what's happened, but also feel comfortable advocating for it and talking about it. And they're really leading the way on unlocking that trauma. You know, part of, I think, the trauma is that we just haven't talked about it. It was something that we all knew happened, but we just never talked about it because it was too hard to talk about. And these young people are doing it. So they all spoke. Several of them are Lakota language teachers in Rosebud, and they spoke in Lakota. And one little girl, I think she's first or second grade, came up to the front and was holding the signs. And so I said, "Do you want to introduce yourself?" And she introduced herself in Lakota. And she goes to the Ocheti Shakoi Community Academy, but she introduced herself in Lakota and told me who her parents were. And I just couldn't believe it. You know, we're witnessing it, and we get to be part of that. We get to be part of the revitalization, the reclamation, and the healing. And I look forward to that. So we will continue to look for ways that we can, you know, move the mark on intergenerational healing. And, you know, your mom would always say, "You girls," and then laugh and say, "I know you're women. I know you're, you know, mothers, but you're girls to me." And I think about those kids yesterday, you know, and I call them kids, and they're not kids either. They're in their 20s, you know, young people, late teens, but it really feels good to feel the connection and see the generational caring about this story, but also advocacy. And it's really exciting. Looking forward to our next event on the site and being able to continue to figure out ways we tell this story, and we tell it from a place that encourages healing and reconciliation.
Thank you so much, Amy, for those perspectives. And it was wonderful when you brought up your daughters, and then they had the old picture, we put that in there in the film, of those girls at the school and what they were feeling. But now, as you said, over the generations, now our young ones have that ability to have that empowerment and pride of who they are as Indigenous people. So thank you for sharing that personal experience. And your young ones are doing wonderful. So I'm very proud of you and the younger generation that you're impacting as well. And speaking of generations, Jill, if you wouldn't mind, we're grandparents, so we're always talking about the future of our young ones, and we want them to have a good life and be proud of who they are, not only as Lakota, but Yurok and Hoopa. They have a variety of tribal representation. But if you could share your perspectives of a grandmother and the just those viewpoints of those future generations that we can't help but have as grandparents. And the lens changes every time, every level of generation. As a parent, your lens changes, and boy, does it change as a grandparent, because we know that's, could be the last generation that we see personally. And we just want to do what we can. And I know you and I do everything we can for our tacojas, our young ones, but if you could just give a perspective of what it means for all of us as human beings for our future generations.
Wow. That'd be a whole nother webinar, hun. I think for us, though, with our grandchildren, it's to support them, but not only our grandchildren, we are the grandparents to any child who is the same age. And we want to support them and keep them dreaming. And I think whenever a child reaches out to us, we need to do whatever we can to support that child and let them have those dreams. I think with everything children have to face today, from the social, engaging in social media, and how much that can have it can have both a positive and negative impact, and we need to be mindful about that and monitor that for our children. We also need to give them those opportunities to have those big dreams of being whatever they want to be. And I was thinking about it this weekend when we were attending the Environmental Leadership Conference, that kids can be scared with what's happening to Mother Earth and all of the changes that we're seeing in the weather and the destruction. And I think, as corny as it sounds, they are the future. They are the ones who are going to take us to the next level, and we have to ingrain that in them, that they're going to be the ones who solve these problems that we have made or that we are participating in making. And so when we have children or even colleagues who need the extra support, I think we need to be there, because there's nobody else. We just have to be there for each other. And that's really hard. I think it's really hard in Indian country, especially when we have so much trauma. And that trauma often will permeate or result in kind of this negative mindset. And I remember, I'm going to say it again, that when we were first together, and I woke up and I was kind of mumbling around, and you're like, "What's wrong?" I said, "No. I just woke up on the wrong side of the bed." You said, "Quick, go back to bed, get out the other side." And it's I had never really thought of it, that we have a lot of power individually with determining how we're the only thing that we can control is ourselves and how we respond to things. So it's much better to try to respond to it in a positive way than not. But we have to keep that support for family and creating those moments. Again, we were talking about this weekend that families, we need to take that time to put our phone down and really engage with each other. And we need that. We need to bring back that engagement with each other socially, so that we can support one another. Otherwise, we're just islands out there by ourselves. And when we're talking about everything our grandparents, like when I think about everything that my grandfather went through, that your mom went through with boarding schools, and to come out the other end to be such positive people, so assured and so loving and giving, that we are just so fortunate. And what strong people. We come from some of the strongest people on earth, and we need to remember that what we do today is a result of the hard work that our ancestors put into it. And then what we are doing today, somebody else is going to come behind us and say the same thing about us. Hopefully that's what we can strive for, right?
Yes, and thank you for bringing up this weekend, because I found it as an environmental conference. I saw the mix of the elders that got things started, and then these kids, college and high school, that were there ready to take over and really having a passion for defending Mother Earth. So that's another generation that's outside of our indigenous populations that see that value and what we need to do collectively for our Mother Earth, literally. So thank you for sharing that perspective. And it was good that we took CJ, our grandson, with us, so he learns these type of things and gets that experience similar to what we've done with the kids, and doing what we can as grandparents and elders to share that traditional knowledge and perspective. So I know one of the questions that came over is how can we get Orange Shirt Day recognized in America? And you know what? I want to tip my hat to the folks at the VCU, the staff in Richmond, Virginia, that all of them wore orange shirts today in honor of a day that I'm sure the university's going, what's up with the orange shirt? But that's another step in taking that, just being able to just wear shirts in a university setting suddenly will educate others that are not aware of this outside of Indian country. So I think it's so important as, as elders. And then Amy's not a grandparent yet, but she's in training. Hey, and she's going to be at that next level of elders when, Jill and I, when we make our journey, she'll be there, training that next generation. And that's what we want to, not only for us in Indian country, but all of us as human beings and two-legged. So again, with what we can do is those little things like at the VCU and other places that are, many people are wearing these type of shirts right here, to remember our children and that they count and they should be remembered. And, that's why I'm doing this, because I know Mom would want me to represent and bring attention to this, because she would have been walking there physically yesterday, Amy, and my brother was there sending me video and pictures, and I just said, Mom is there, bro. And so I'm just glad that was there yesterday. So Amy, any other perspectives? I don't know if there's any other questions from our chat or Facebook or not, Lucian, but if you could look for those and we can start to close out, if you would.
I think the one thing I would say on how to help make Orange Shirt Day a recognized day in the U.S. is to support Senate Bill 1723 and House Bill 7227, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Policies Act, and its focus is on research and really uncovering documents from both secular schools and BIE schools. But I think that's one way for people who like to engage in the political climate or political realm, that's a one way. And if you would go to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition page, they have a good site they have a toolkit, and you can figure out who your senators and Congress people are. And I would encourage everybody to write to their senators, write to your Congress people, and tell them why it's important that we have all this information. I think this is one way of formalizing it within the US. And I think Orange Shirt Day comes along with this. Once we can get this into through the legislator and get it into law, it's how things work here. And so I think people could go there, check out NABS. They've done some amazing work on advocacy and getting people on the same page, and have some talking points and everything. But support the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Act.
Thank you so much, Amy. And we do need our non-Indian allies, as Mom would say, to help us get that word out and support us as, folks that can influence policy and law. And obviously voting in support of some of these initiatives will bring this more to the light. And we don't want to just share the negative. We want to share how resilient, as Jill mentioned, how Mom and her grandpa and many of our relatives that had to go through these schools, and some are still with us today. Mom would she would be here today, I know, sharing her story.
Yes.
And I miss that, in terms of having her around for that. But again, these are some of those expectations that she and the other elders that kept this story alive had, and they gave that to us. So we also need to remember the elders are traditional wisdom keepers that continually make this, something that we must remember as younger generations. And now that, I've come to realize elders don't have elders. And as Joel and I lose our, elders, and I just lost a mentor from San Diego State University, and he gave me an opportunity to succeed in academia and making an impact for Indian country in my small way, just trying to do what I can to help that next generation so that all of our grandchildren can have that pride and inclusion, regardless of who they are. So those are some of those challenges and realities. But again, we want to celebrate the resiliency of those folks that became elders and knowledge keepers to teach us what they went through. And then it's our responsibility to ensure that their memories are never forgotten, just as the elders did at the meetings that brought up what about the children. And folks didn't even bring that up or were thinking about it, but thankfully those unchis, those grandmas were there. They again, those wisdom keepers, those life givers as women, they have that connection to Mother Earth as life givers. And we want to make sure that we make sure those stories are told and remembered for our future generations. And as you shared very eloquently in the film, it was wonderful to have that, that pride of your young ones, and I have that same feeling in my, my son and our grandkids out there. They know who they are as indigenous people of this land. And they're going to have that not only as for themselves, but the future generations and their little cliques of people, their little circle of folks that they will have that they'll influence as friends and colleagues. So that's the beauty of the that generational responsibility that we have to represent 7 generations behind and 7 generations ahead. And that's a wonderful, beautiful philosophy, but it's a great responsibility as well. And so we're representing as best we can today with you that attended, not only here on Zoom, but on Facebook. Thank you for joining us. And I'm not sure if we have any other Facebook questions or other questions at this point, Lucian, but any final statements, Amy, Jill, before we sign off for today? And we really appreciate folks joining us.
I do want to say this is the 100th year celebration of Native Americans being recognized as citizens. In June, I think it was June 2nd, that we became citizens of this great nation. And also that it was in 2009 that we get that freebie holiday, the Native American holiday, that's that day after Thanksgiving. If we can get something a little more than that, it would be great. But I think part of it is recognizing Americans being willing to recognize their history, not feel bad about it, but to acknowledge it, change the trajectory of the course, and put things forth like this. It's kind of sad that Canada has already done all this and we're a little late to the game. But also, I want to say this: you're going to rebroadcast this, correct?
Yes, it's going to be available on the Facebook, as well as it will be burned into YouTube on my channel, as well as VCU's channel. And remember the children's channel if you want. We want to make sure this is available, not only the film, but some of our discussion and perspectives that we've been able to share on Orange Shirt Day. So Lucian handles that side of the technology. But thank you, Jill, for sharing those perspectives. As an elder, we got to face it, we're part of that group now.
I missed that memo.
Hey, right. But again, Amy, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a closing statement so that we can close in a good way. And from my personal standpoint, I'm so proud of you and so happy that you were one of Mom's, grandchildren, and you're a Takoja for Mama, and of course now we're family as well. So Palamia. So Amy, if you could.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jim. One of the greatest gifts your mom gave me was you and Don, and the idea that you treat everybody like family. So I always really appreciate you both, and appreciate Don for being there yesterday too. I didn't mean, we made each other cry standing there, and I was like, I'm sorry if I'm making it worse, but it was good to have him there. It was a comfort to have him there. And I really appreciate that. I think from the remembering the children side of things, we will continue. We'll definitely get the film up on our website, and we're going to have some lesson plans that will be put out and shared as well. Just encouraging that we continue teaching this and that we continue teaching the next generation, and that we lift that veil of shame and blame from our ancestors, all of our ancestors, and that we can start moving to a place of truth and healing, and be able to address these things. So really proud to be part of this, proud that we'll have it on the website and that we'll get to keep sharing it, and it can be used as a resource. We hope to see it in all classrooms across the country, you know, and our greatest hope here is to see this in the classrooms in Rapid City, so that our community can start coming together around this part of our history together, this part of our complex and complicated history in this community, and start getting to know our neighbors, getting to know each other a little better, and building a healthier community for our kids and our grandkids. So really proud of the film, proud to show it today. So thank you, Jimmy, for setting this all up. After yesterday, I was in no condition to plan anything, so it was nice just to be able to jump on, and appreciate you both, though. Appreciate the family that your mom shared with us, and really proud of the film. So thank you, Jim. Really appreciate you.
Wopila. Thanks, sis. And just a couple of comments that we got in, and thank you so much for the nice comments regarding the film and our story. But we do appreciate you enjoying that. And for our non-Indian ally out of Washington State, thank you for doing what you can in the state of Washington. Many great tribal nations out in your way. And then again, thank you that we were able to share this space with you. So thank you for those comments that came in. And we will continue with this story and continue the fight, the message, whatever, the walk, the march, whatever we have to do to ensure that not only our children from the boarding schools, but our people are represented and known in our education systems and in general society. And as an elder over the years, I've seen that happen in many capacities. So it's wonderful to be part of this, and I'm glad I was trained to do something for those next generations. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for the example that you provided. And that's, again, how we're fortunate to have those parents that many of our kids that went to these boarding schools did not. And how resilient are they to be able to be good, strong elders? And that's just something that I'm really proud of, to be, their son. So thank you so much for everybody joining us. And this is going to be available again on YouTube and our Facebooks. And keep making a difference and making those footprints for future generations. Thank you so much for joining us today.